Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for a conversation about President Biden's energy policy and why keeping the lights on is harder than you think. We have three fantastic panelists here today for a discussion about the challenges facing our energy infrastructure and the policies that could reshape the electric grid. I'm going to give you a rundown of what's going to happen. I'll introduce each of our panelists and we'll hear their remarks. I'll kick off our panel discussion with a few questions, but we would really like to hear from you. Many of you listening in have submitted questions, which we appreciate so much. We're going to get to as many of those as possible. And if you have a question or if one comes to mind during the discussion, you can submit them by clicking the Q&A feature below. By the end of our discussion, we hope to wrap up with a few key recommendations from our panelists for energy policies that can have the most impact. So just to set the scene, this discussion is happening at a really critical time. The president has an ambitious energy agenda that would move the country towards more renewables like wind and solar. Congress just passed a $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package that includes a lot of energy funding. There is also a spending bill hanging in the balance in Congress right now with potentially more money at stake. And the COP conference is continuing in Scotland. And I want to say a few words about our electric grid. The grid is really amazing. It has been called the world's largest machine. It generates power and pretty much instantly delivers it, which is kind of like magic. But the grid is also under a lot of stress right now. It's old. It's a system that was designed to deliver power from a central power plant out to customers. And now we have things like solar panels that can send power back to the grid and lots of renewables coming online that provide power intermittently. There's also a push to electrify everything, including our vehicles. So we're going to maybe need more power generation, or we are going to have to ask people to use electricity in a different way than we have in the past. And we're seeing more dramatic weather events that can damage the grid and cause us to interact with it in a really unpleasant way when we lose power. So our three panelists today are amazing. Joining us will be Lori Bennear, Associate Professor of Energy Economics and Policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. AJ Jha, Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. And John D. Graham, Professor of Risk Analysis and former Dean of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. And we are going to start off with Lori.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. I'm really excited to be here with these other fabulous panelists and talking to you about energy policy, and particularly energy policy as it intersects with climate policy. As Jennifer mentioned, there's a lot going on right now in DC, in Scotland, globally about energy policy as it intersects with climate policy. So we know from the IPCC report that, by IPCC, I mean the International Panel on Climate Change, that in order to limit mean global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius implies reaching net zero carbon dioxide emissions globally around 2050, and also requires deep reductions in other emissions of non-CO2 chemicals, particularly methane. And in the US, Biden has pledged to get 50% reduction by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. So those are the goalposts, right? That's sort of where we think we need to be with our energy policy in order to achieve our climate goals. So what do we actually need to do to get there? And what do we actually see in these major pieces of legislation that either have just passed or are still making their way through Congress right now? And what is left that we still need to tackle even with those bills? So if we start with what we need, I'm an energy economist. I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying one of the most elegant and simple ways to try to provide incentives for both producers and consumers to make the right decisions about their energy choices is to put a price on carbon dioxide. And so that would be a carbon tax in its most simple form. And it also has some really interesting implications for how we can actually then use that tax revenue to reduce potential distributional impacts of carbon taxes. So energy is something we all need to live, right? Pretty much. And so if we increase the price of energy, whether that's our electricity, whether that's the fuels that we use to get ourselves from point A to point B, it tends to be the case that lower income households spend a higher share of their income on those services. So if we tax them, those taxes tend to be regressive. But we've seen successfully in British Columbia and Canada and in other places ways to use carbon tax revenues to then actually give a dividend to lower income households to help reduce some of those negative distributional impacts. So that's one thing I think we need. And that's going to be the one thing we actually are not going to get from these bills that we're talking about today. We also need rapid deployment of existing technologies to reduce CO2, particularly in the generation of electricity. And so that's really solar and wind, and there is potentially a role for nuclear in that as well. And electrification, moving away from natural gas for homes, businesses, and fleets. And I believe John Graham will talk as our last panelist more about the transportation side of this. But accompanying that rapid deployment of these existing technologies, solar and wind, we also need significant investments in infrastructure. As Jennifer mentioned, the grid is amazing, but it was not designed with solar and wind in mind. And the current infrastructure is frankly not up to the challenge that we are facing if we want to actually transition to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we need a price on carbon. We need rapid deployment, and that involves infrastructure investments. We also need investments in technologies that either don't exist or are extremely expensive right now. So this is different from deployment of existing technologies. These are really things having to do with carbon capture. Some of the models in the International Panel on Climate Change don't actually close at 1.5 degrees Celsius without something that doesn't exist right now, which is a way to generate electricity while actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so this involves significant investments in R&D. And we need to do all this while we center environmental justice concerns, because we're talking about really significant changes that, again, affect electricity and energy prices, which we know is regressive, but we're also talking about significant land use changes, right? And we need to be very cognizant of the environmental justice impacts of those land use changes. So that's what I think we need. What do we get with these current bills? With the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we get significant investments in the electric grid to better integrate renewables and to help support the grid so that it's more resilient to changing climates, which include things like freak ice storms in Texas, increasing hurricane frequency and intensity, wildfires, et cetera. We get investments in EV charging. We get some investments in carbon capture technologies, and we get some money to help incentivize households to do things like weatherization and conserve energy. We get with the Build Back Better bill that's being considered, lots of subsidies and credits for consumer choice. So they chose not to go down the carbon tax pathway, but rather to subsidize and provide tax credits to support consumers buying electric vehicles, weatherizing their homes, making energy conservation choices. We get some investment in carbon capture, particularly through reforestation and coastal restoration. And we do see some focus on environmental justice, particularly around again, how these credits can be targeted, but really no focus on these land use changes, which I think is an opportunity that we're missing. So we get a lot from these bills. We don't get everything that's on Lori's wish list, right? But we do get a lot. And I think I want to end by saying that we cannot overstate how big of a deal this is right now. It is not everything that we might want. I do wish that we could have a carbon tax in particular, and the loss of that pricing mechanism is significant. But if 2 years ago you told me we had half of this, I would think we were making significant investments that we've been asking for a long time, that could provide a generational shift really in how we generate electricity and use energy in this country. So to quote our current president, and something that he said about another big piece of legislation, this is a big bleeping deal, and there's a lot to be worked out here. So back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was awesome. And I'd like to invite AJ to share his screen and his opening remarks.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. What Lori and Jennifer said really sets up my opening remarks well. So I'm going to jump right into the policy landscape, which, has been described already. But just to be clear, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has already passed the House and the Senate and will hopefully be signed into law by President Biden shortly. On the other hand, there's the spending bill, the Build Back Better Act, which is currently in the House, will have to go through the Senate. And so that's much more in flux as to whether or not it will go through and become law. So with that policy landscape in mind, I'm going to focus in on two kind of sets of policy changes, or what is going on with policy right now. The first one is electricity transmission. I was preempted by none other than John Oliver on Sunday on that portion of my remarks, so check that out. But I'm going to talk about electricity transmission, what's in the bill, and what could be expanded going forward. And the other part I'm going to talk about is demand response. So as everything becomes electrified, as Jennifer mentioned, how do we get people to respond in terms of consuming less when there's less electricity available and consuming more when there is more electricity available? So let's jump right into electricity transmission. So let's start with a simple example. If a wind farm is built or a utility scale solar panel farm is built, you're going to need at least one transmission line to connect that farm to the grid. Okay, so that's it in its simplest form and what you would need in terms of upgrades of transmission, but that's not all, right? More broadly, think about Texas, where a lot of the wind farms are out west, and a lot of the demand centers where people and firms want to consume electricity is in the east. So if there's not enough transmission capacity to bring the wind generation from the west to the demand centers in the east, what will happen? Well, less of that wind will be used by the demand centers in the east, and instead, typically a plant closer to those cities will turn on in order to satisfy demand. And typically that's going to be fossil fuel, right? A plant that burns coal or burns natural gas in order to produce electricity. As Lori mentioned, in very rare cases, there's simply with an absence of transmission capacity or transmission capacity being at its limit, there's going to be in rare cases consumer blackouts, right? There isn't simply enough generation capacity near enough to the cities to satisfy all demand. Think Texas, think New Orleans, California with the wildfires, even earlier the Northeast during the polar vortex. So building up the grid will both add to resiliency and will bring lower cost wind and solar resources, electricity generation from those sources to demand centers. Okay, so what exactly does the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provide in terms of transmission? Well, it allocates $10 to $12 billion to build transmission towers and wires, which most economists and most energy people that I've seen, they're saying it's inadequate. We want more money, but it's a good start. But two other important components of the act that don't get discussed as much, which are just as important in my mind, is the first, federal financing of transmission projects. So there's transmission developers who don't have a counterparty, right? And so they're worried, well, will I really get the financing needed to actually build this out? Will I be able to be profitable? Federal financing reduces that risk of, not being able to find a counterparty to buy that transmission capacity. Second point, increased federal power to overrule rejections of permits to build interstate transmission capacity by states. So if a state says, hey, we don't want that transmission capacity built there, we're rejecting the permit for that transmission line, now there's increased federal power to overrule that rejection. The second point I'm going to talk about, so shifting away from transmission capacity, I'm going to talk about demand side response. And so this one's pretty intuitive to people, right? If you see your electricity bill each month, your electricity price doesn't vary based on day or night, doesn't vary based on, hey, a lot of people want electricity now, whereas not a lot of people want electricity in a couple of hours. So that's different from, say, Uber, where you get surge pricing, or pretty much any good where, if there's more demand for it, the prices go up. And so it's going to become increasingly important to get retail prices that vary with the cost of producing and distributing electricity. I'll give you two examples of why it's increasingly important now with our shift towards renewable resources. First, solar panels produce electricity during the day, but not in the evening. So you would hope that retail prices would be lower during the day when solar is generating and there's a lot of electricity available, and higher in the evening when solar stops producing because the sun is down. The second point is, think about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are typically charged in the evening when everybody comes home from work. And they also use electricity for a bunch of other purposes too, right? They're doing their laundry, they're, cooking their dinner. Those retail prices, again, aren't higher in the evening when demand for electricity is the highest, okay? And so that demand response aspect, at least to my knowledge, isn't a part of either of the bills that I mentioned that are in consideration, right? So the major concern with why that isn't something that people really consider as being a part of the solution is that households simply don't respond to hourly variation in their retail prices. If I saw that prices were higher in 1 hour, lower in another hour, am I really going to change when I do the laundry or when I cook? Well, perhaps if you were provided automation, such as smart thermostats that can automatically do some of this adjustment for you. Another technique might be to simplify retail prices, not have them vary every hour of the day, but also just have them vary by evening versus the day, or have them vary only for a small amount of hours. You'll get a text message, hey, this is a really high demand hour, please reduce if possible. And that combined with training and information on how to adjust might get us there as well. So let me conclude by saying that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is an important step in terms of building a transmission grid that can support large-scale investment in renewables and reliably provide electricity to consumers. And the reason for that is it provides money for investment, it provides federal financing, so reducing the risk to transmission developers, and it eases the permitting rights, eases the permitting, the regulatory hurdles associated with permitting transmission lines across states. That being said, something that could be incorporated into these policies is incentivizing demand response that will allow retail consumers to respond to prices in a way that when demand is high, they consume less, and when demand is low, they consume more. Thanks. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer.
Thanks so much, AJ. I want to invite John to the screen to share his opening remarks, and from there, we'll go to our panel discussion.
Thank you so much. I want to take a little bit broader view on a global scale of what's happening, because it's an exciting time in the auto industry. We're in the biggest transition since the horse and buggy. And how did we get here? It starts in Japan in the 1970s after the Arab oil embargo, and Japan laid out a plan to convert to electric vehicles. After 20 years of research and development, they scratched their head and said, no, I don't think this is going to work. We're going to go with hybrids. Think Toyota Prius. And now 35% of cars sold in Japan are hybrids, sometimes referred to as conventional hybrids, without plug-in capability. Second big step was California in 1990. They weren't worried about climate change. They're worried because Los Angeles was the most polluted city in the United States of America. They put a zero emission vehicle mandate. Any car company wanting to do business in California, you have to offer a certain number of zero emission cars. Didn't work very well. Battery technology wasn't sophisticated enough, couldn't commercialize these vehicles. However, the progress in consumer electronics, laptops, and so forth made lithium-ion batteries possible for the auto industry. The spillover occurred. You got Tesla, you got the Nissan Leaf, and by 2010, you have plug-in electric vehicles being offered. Third, perhaps most important, is China, 2010. Not climate change, not air pollution, not anything about the environment. Chinese planners wanted a global auto industry. They were very jealous of what Toyota did for Japan, what General Motors did for the US, and what Volkswagen did for Germany. And they came to the conclusion they couldn't compete with the internal combustion engine. The strategy is leapfrog the internal combustion engine and go right to battery electric vehicles. They started with subsidies in 10 Chinese cities. They expanded to 25 cities, and then they went national. And the big way they got people to purchase and use plug-in electric vehicles in the mega cities of Eastern China, they had virtually banned use of cars in the center city because of congestion. But they gave an exemption. If you buy an electric car, you can travel in the center city. And electric vehicle sales boomed in the eastern cities of China. Today, China is transitioning from a subsidies approach to a mandate approach. And they're going to have a certain percentage of electric vehicles all the way up to a very high percentage by 2030 and 2035. Finally, there's the European Union. And up until 2015, the bureaucrats in Brussels weren't particularly interested in electric vehicles because the Germans owned diesel technology. But then there was the scandal, the cheating scandal by Volkswagen, where they deceived the regulators and emitted more pollution than they said they were when these cars were on the road. This destroyed the credibility of the diesel engine technology, and it destroyed the credibility of the German government in the European Union, as Germany was also advocating these diesel technology. The result, the European Union adopted very stringent carbon dioxide standards that basically are forcing a substantial fraction of the market in Europe to be electric vehicles. Moreover, the German government itself, Merkel, the Chancellor Merkel, flip-flops and now advocates electric vehicles and are offering 10,000 euro subsidies for consumers to buy electric vehicles. By the latest count, Germany is up to about 25% market share in electric vehicles. Germany accomplished in 5 years what California could not accomplish in 30 years. Finally, there's Norway, now at almost 90% electric vehicle penetration. How did that happen? It turns out that all they did in Norway was they put heavy taxes on internal combustion vehicles. So when you go into the showroom, if you buy an electric vehicle, it's like $5,000 to $10,000 cheaper than an internal combustion engine vehicle. How their politicians got away with doing that, I don't know. It's not going to happen soon, I don't think, in the US, China, or Europe. What are the unresolved issues about transitioning to electric vehicles? There are a lot of them, and I'm only going to pick a couple and then turn it back over for discussion. First of all, we've got to get the charging infrastructure in place. For wealthy people who can charge at home, this is not a big deal. But for working class people and low income people, people who live in cities and high rises, where are they going to charge these vehicles? You say, oh, there'll be public charging stations. But the electricity is more expensive than at home. There can be waiting lines for these charging stations, and it takes a long time to charge these vehicles. If you go to super fast charging, like 30 minutes, 80% charge, you then degrade the battery, and the battery might not last as long as it would be if you use a regular slow charger in your home. So there's a whole big issue about how to do this right. Second of all, there's the supply chain. The raw materials that go into making lithium-ion batteries and electric motors, where are these materials being mined and processed? Currently, it's dominated by China and other sources that are not necessarily reliable to have an entire transportation economy based on them. So now we have to have a major effort to develop these. It turns out the demand for these raw materials is outstripping supplies. For those of you who follow commodity prices, check lithium, check cobalt, check nickel. This is a big challenge. Final point. We also have the question of what to do with these hybrid electric vehicles or the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. They still have a gasoline engine, but they're combined with electric propulsion. Should we ban these vehicles just like we're going to ban the regular conventional gasoline vehicles? Some argue we need a transition process because some consumers might learn from using a hybrid vehicle or a plug-in hybrid before they get to a fully battery operated vehicle. But other people say, hey, these plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, people never recharge them. They just drive around and refuel them like a gasoline engine. And we need to find a way to make sure people use these plug-in hybrids properly. So that's just a sketch of some of the issues. What an exciting time. And to build a career in this area, this is an industry you want to be in. Thank you so much. I look forward to the comments and questions.
Thanks so much, John. I want to invite AJ and Lori back to the screen, and we will launch into our panel discussion. I'm just going to ask a question or two, and then we're going to quickly get to audience questions, which are rolling in and are really fantastic. I wanted to ask you guys if I know a lot of people who watch the industry think that the carbon tax is kind of the easiest and most elegant way to go, as Lori mentioned, but do you think it's realistic that do we ever end up with a carbon tax in the US, or are we going to go down the path of these tax credits?
Well, I think inevitably we're going to have a carbon tax, or we're not going to get to the goals that Lori described. But the other thing to keep in mind is you got goods being traded across borders with different carbon footprints. And one of the most elegant solutions there to make sure that you don't hurt industries in clean areas is to have a border adjustment tax on the carbon footprint. It may be we get to a carbon tax first by having border adjustment taxes and then have a national tax.
Right. I agree completely. I think the one political issue with the border adjustment is it could be considered a tariff. And there's the political kind of struggle going on with, oh, well, you're putting a border adjustment in for climate purposes, but it really is raising the prices of goods in other countries. So in terms of the politics surrounding a border adjustment, I think it's the right answer. But again, politically, will it be something that can get through? It is a question. But I'm completely, I think, yeah, economists for carbon tax combined with a border adjustment to help compete with other countries where a carbon tax isn't in place is kind of the first best policy.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in to say it clearly doesn't seem to be feasible right now. We're doing a lot of things and we're focusing on really subsidies and tax credits rather than taxes. My prediction is we won't be as successful with that as we would like, and that they tend to be taken up, the evidence, at least so far, is they tend to be taken up by wealthier people who might have made these choices anyway. So it's a more expensive way to get the kinds of consumer decisions that we might want in particular. And I suspect as that plays out, there may be more than political support for a carbon tax if we can sell it right. And I think the dividend aspect of that is really critical to actually getting, everyday Americans to understand, yes, I'm going to pay more, for my gasoline, but there's a dividend that will come back to me as well. And I think that can make it an easier sell over time.
A lot of this, it seems like Americans are going to be kind of on a learning curve in terms of using electricity at different times or adopting electric vehicles. We had one question come in already saying, pointing out that in some states, in some markets, you do see demand pricing that incentivizes you to use more electricity at a certain time of day. I'm curious how much of a transition, how radical this is, your thoughts on that, because I don't think electricity is something that people think about the way that, we always see gas prices posted every time we go run errands somewhere. It's very in your face. And I'm wondering, if we just are going to end up having a different relationship with electricity than what we have now.
Right. Yeah. The prevailing wisdom is that absent any sort of shift in like information or shift in attitudes, that people, like you said, just won't respond to electricity prices that are different across different hours of the day. They'll consume electricity when they want, just because it's such a small part of most consumers' budgets, right? They're spending on food, they're spending on transportation. So yeah, absent kind of automation, or absent, automation being something like a smart thermostat, or some, like you said, some radical shift in attitudes, we're not going to really see that responsive consumption that we need. And I do want to mention on the California front, right now we have there's time of use pricing for many consumers, which is, like you said, in certain hours of the day, you face a higher price than other hours of the day. But even that is kind of a very distant second best to real-time pricing, right? You think about Uber, the prices are changing every minute based on what the demand is. So 4 to 9 in the winter in California is going to be very different than 4 to 9 p.m. in the summer in California. So that is even a first kind of preliminary step to getting this real-time pricing, where electricity prices vary based on actual demand conditions in the day and not necessarily just between evening and the day.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with AJ first that there's to do this at real-time pricing is information overload for any consumer. Like there's just no way people are responding to that. And that's where the automation comes in, right? That technology allows you to set once and forget. But we find that even with that, sometimes people forget to set the one time. So there's still a learning curve for consumers on some of that. It is the case that different utilities across the country have different approaches to peak and off-peak pricing. Here in North Carolina, it's an option, and we're seeing more people opt in. And this links back to John's. When you buy that electric vehicle, right, and you're charging it in your garage at night, you actually do want to opt into the time of use pricing, because then your charging at night goes down to 9 cents a kilowatt hour, right? So it's a link together then with some of the big consumer choices that we're hoping to advocate for, including electrification of the vehicle fleet.
John, did you want to chime in on that, or should we go to audience questions?
No, let's go to audience. That's fine.
Awesome. We have gotten a lot of questions about nuclear, which is a really interesting area right now. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on where we are with nuclear in terms of, do you see any growth potential there? Is the political landscape, shifting that would allow more nuclear? And there's a lot of, kind of small reactors in the planning stages right now, kind of when do you see those being a factor?
Well, the small modular nuclear reactors are extremely promising. And if you look at the 2030 to 2040 timeframe, it's possible you'll see some penetration there. But one thing you have to keep in mind is a lot of the environmental groups, the major environmental groups who are deeply concerned about climate change, they still haven't come around on nuclear, whether it's small modular or whether it's big nuclear. And they are going to be a difficult group to deal with in this transition. I don't think the United States is likely to be a leader in this territory, but I think you might find some other countries in the world moving faster to nuclear than we are.
Agreed completely. Like this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've written at least 2 papers on this topic, one for the United States, one for Germany. Germany is in the process of phasing out their nuclear, almost complete in that process. And the message is very clear. You're shutting down nuclear either in the United States or in Germany. Currently, it's a fossil fuel fired generator that's coming online to replace it. Nuclear is a baseload technology. It can move up or move down as needed in order to fill in the gaps of when wind isn't blowing or sun isn't shining. Nuclear can increase in order to fill in that gap. Not so with other, like I said, wind and solar is dispatchable. So right now what is happening is nuclear is being shut down. A coal or gas-fired power plant is starting up, leading to increases in local air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. And so that is kind of the stark reality of what we're dealing with right now. But as John mentioned, resistance to nuclear power is prevalent from environmental groups, both historically due to Chernobyl, more recently Fukushima. And what they're pointing to is kind of the cost and risks associated with storing and disposing of nuclear waste. That's really what they're thinking about. I've seen some about nuclear accident risk as well, but really at least the focus I've seen is on the cost of storing and disposing of nuclear waste. And so really, like John said, I don't think we'll see United States being a leader in that, just because the cost of complying with safety regulations here in the United States are sufficiently high that I don't think it'll necessarily be a leader here, but other countries building nuclear could develop that technology that the United States eventually adopts.
Yeah, and in our book, Policy Shock, Evaluating Regulatory Responses to Crises in Oil Spills, Nuclear Accidents, and Financial Crises, it was the Fukushima case studies that were actually the most interesting, because we got the most diverse responses from different governments, even within Europe. I mean, Germany decides it's going to phase out its nuclear, which, as AJ said, means they're importing coal-fired power from Poland. I mean, it's definitely not a great deal from a climate change perspective. But France, which gets over 80% of its power from nuclear already, basically, stayed the course, made no change. I had an undergraduate student who had a survey in the field, asking people's opinions about nuclear power at that moment. And we were expecting actually to see that older people who remembered 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl would be more hostile to nuclear than younger people. But we actually found quite the opposite. And then Fukushima happened, and people's, it was an incident that just reminded people of the risks and changed that narrative almost overnight. And I do think there's a way to come back from that. I do think the small modular nuclear has a lot of potential, but it's a big image to overcome in people's mind that, it's like it's the mushroom cloud as opposed to like we're generating electrons. And so, I guess I agree with the other two. I don't think the US is going to be a leader here.
Okay, fair enough. We have some questions coming in for Lori, but I'm sure that AJ and John will want to chime in as well, that get to, I guess, some fairness issues in terms of if we did have like a carbon, some kind of carbon tax, what that might do to low income households, or if we're raising the cost of energy and consumers' bills, if basically how you make sure that lower income people are benefiting. I think we've seen this in EVs a little bit where, the early adopters have been wealthier people. Wondering if we could talk a little bit about fairness and how, as we move towards more things being electrified, what needs to be done in terms of policy to make sure that everybody is included.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So I'm really happy that this issue is being raised. I think it's critical, and particularly when we're talking about energy, because as I said before, it tends to be that poor people spend a higher percentage of their income on electricity and other energy services, and so if you increase the cost of those things, the burden of that falls more heavily on lower income households. So I think when people think of a carbon tax, that's kind of easy for them to wrap their head around, and they can bring an environmental justice critique to a carbon tax more easily than say, what about these subsidies or these tax credits? But it turns out there's a pretty strong environmental justice critique of those as well. My point is, this is really hard. And it's important that we keep those issues sort of central as we're thinking through this. So for a carbon tax, what we've seen in British Columbia is the use of those tax revenues to do a dividend back to consumers, but a higher dividend to lower income households, right? And you could phase that out with increases in income so that you're actually offsetting the impact on budgets for the people at the lowest income tiers. Even if we're going to stick with the credits and subsidies, you don't want those credits and subsidies to go to people who are going to do this thing anyway and can afford to do this thing anyway. You have to really target them then to the communities and the households that otherwise would not be able to take advantage of them. And you need to structure them in a way so that if, say, you don't have a tax bill at the end of the year, there's still some benefit to you. I don't care if I have a tax credit if my tax bill at the end of the year is zero, right? So just focusing on, sort of electricity and fairness, I think there are ways in which we can address some of those issues, and it's important to sort of keep them central as we're thinking through them. And I'll let others speak. I could go on this for a long time, so I'm going to stop.
Yes, it's also important to keep in mind how all these subsidies and tax credits are financed. Who's paying for these things? And if you trace through how this is ultimately being done, a lot of this gets back either directly through tax policy or indirectly through the debt that we're building in our federal deficit situation back to the shoulders of middle income taxpayers and to some extent low income taxpayers. So there isn't any obvious way just to hit the billionaires and not have anybody else pay anything. So subsidies and tax credits are going to be financed, and we're all going to pay for those. The second more important point is you have to have a very smart government to have subsidies and tax credits work well, because they have to know which technologies to pick and which companies to give the money to. And they have to do it without any corruption or without any influence in politics. In contrast, you put the price on the carbon, you rebate the money to low-income Americans, and then you let the private sector compete and decide what are the best technologies and how it should be allocated. Remember, politicians love to give out money. It puts them in the highlight, right? But for them to vote for a tax, that's a much more difficult vote for them to make. But in the long run, it works better. And if it's done right, it's better for low-income people.
Right. I love both of those points. The one point I would add is the absence of a carbon tax also reduces equity, right? So the climate change impacts disproportionately impact lower income people. The local air pollution impacts also disproportionately impact lower income people who live near fossil fuel fired power plants, who live near manufacturing facilities that are heavy polluters. So the impacts of climate change, think hurricanes, think just extreme temperatures, how do you adapt to that, are also borne by lower income consumers or lower income people, as are the local air pollution impacts. So not having a carbon tax also has equity implications as well. So we should keep that in mind when deciding how to implement a carbon tax or whether or not to do so.
We're getting a lot of different audience questions about the disposal of batteries, where wind turbines might end up, kind of what you do with all of this new stuff when it gets to the end of its life cycle. And I'm wondering if you guys can address a little bit, whether we need a, kind of a whole new industry for figuring out where all of this stuff goes, or if we face issues down the line, in terms of, does this stuff become like the next nuclear waste where nobody wants it in their community?
Well, it's a great question. In the case of lithium, we're having trouble getting communities to want to mine lithium in their community, or to process the lithium in their community, and on the tail end to dispose of lithium and battery materials in landfills is also not something we want to have happen. So recycling of the batteries or their components is one of the most exciting areas right now in this industry. And you have startups, numerous ones in the US, in Europe, and in Asia that are working on different strategies for doing this. The most promising technique now seems to be you at least take the cathodes, you grind them down, and you use those to make new cathodes. And that will take a piece of the recycling challenge off the table.
That's perfect. I have nothing to add to that. It's a challenge, and I think, hopefully the technology will evolve, as John mentioned, to get there. But I think John said it perfectly.
All right, thanks. We're getting also some questions about, we've been talking a lot about this centralized power generation that we've had and kind of this delivery out model. And I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about decentralizing the power grid. There's, a lot of rooftop solar, community solar, efforts to sort of spread generation around in communities and closer to end users. And I guess, where are we with that? And where do you see that headed? Or do we have hurdles to making that happen?
Well, I'll take a crack at this first and then others can chime in. I mean, there are certainly some advantages to smaller sort of microgrid scale power generation, that it could be islandable and hence somewhat more resilient in some circumstances. But there are disadvantages too, that, by not being connected in some other circumstances, it's less resilient. It is actually far more challenging than I think people realize to actually run a community scale microgrid. We did some work with the first community microgrid in Puerto Rico and Toro Negro community up in the mountains. It's 28 households, very tight-knit community that have been wanting to do this for a long time, but you're essentially becoming your own utility, right? Which means you've got to handle the billing. When Uncle, Juan doesn't pay, you've got to go over and knock on the door and sort of figure out how you're going to deal with that. And it requires an enormous amount of community capacity to actually do that well. In addition, most of the time, it's going to end up being more expensive, although, again, that's not universally true relative to larger scale renewables that we then still send over a high voltage transmission grid.
I agree. I also think that a better option might be to develop grid scale energy storage technologies. So as battery prices continue to come down, that's going to make possible the storing of electricity from wind and solar to be used at different times. And we do need a lot of R&D on this. We need to bring down the cost substantially, but I think that's probably a more promising idea for large-scale development of electricity than distributed energy approaches. But it will be a mix of both of them, and both of them will have a market to some extent.
Yeah, I agree that grid scale solar or grid scale storage is going to have to be a key part of this moving forward. In terms of distributed generation, our grid currently isn't designed to deal with that two-way flow you mentioned up top, Jennifer, meaning you think about a rooftop solar panel bringing electricity back to the grid. We're usually used to people consuming electricity one-way flow. So there's, in addition to transmission infrastructure upgrades, which is what I talked about in my opening remarks, there's going to be distribution infrastructure upgrades, which are those smaller lines that go into people's homes and distribute electricity to those homes. There's going to need to be increased capacity to have that be a two-way flow where electricity comes back along those lines as well. So that's going to be a key part. If the distributed generation ends up being the way forward, it's going building up that distribution infrastructure is also going to need to be key.
Thank you. That's super helpful. We also have a lot of questions coming in about pricing of fossil fuels and how that affects things. We're seeing, gasoline prices and diesel prices rising. There's a lot of talk about natural gas spiking even more this winter. And I guess, how do you see price fluctuations on the fossil fuel side, and what's going on in the oil and natural gas world to impact clean energy policy? Like, does it spur people to kind of maybe stick with what they've got, or does it encourage you to electrify, more, in a speedier fashion? What are you watching in that area right now?
Well, short-term movements in oil and gasoline prices don't have a big impact on investors because they're looking at making that investment and what's going to happen 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And anybody who's a serious student of the oil industry knows we have a bigger problem in the long run, which is as we use less of oil, its price is going to come down. And therefore, people are going to want to use more of it as its price comes down. And that's why another reason why the carbon tax is so important. So yes, in the short run, you're seeing these short run movements in oil, gasoline, and natural gas prices. But the medium run and long run look like low prices to most people who are making bets in this market.
And to add on to John's point, I mean, that infrastructure question, right? As prices get low moving forward, there's going to be even less incentive to build natural gas pipelines and oil pipelines. And the question becomes, do we want to put that steel in the ground if we're thinking about transitioning away from fossil fuels in the long run? But in the shorter run, there's going to be people facing high gas prices, high gasoline prices, high natural gas prices for home heating. And so this kind of tension between the short run, where people are getting left behind with high fuel prices, versus the longer run, where we do foresee kind of lower prices and perhaps less oil and gas use if something like a carbon price is put into place. That tension to me is very interesting, and it's not clear what the answer is in terms of should we be incentivizing short-run building of infrastructure of gas and oil pipelines in order to alleviate burdens in the short run, or should we be thinking, well, in the longer run, we won't need those pipelines because we'll be shifting away to cleaner technologies?
So I agree with both of you on the sort of the investor side of oil and gas, but I also want to address sort of the consumer side, because I think that came up, the way Jennifer framed this. So, you're actually thinking about real people who are living in their existing housing stock, right? With their existing heating infrastructure, who are facing high natural gas prices this winter, right? And so there's a short-term problem of what do we do for them? right? And they're, I mean, I just come out on, we've got to do stuff to keep them warm this winter and not worry so much about the long run climate effects of that, right? As we then provide both incentives in terms of a carbon tax and some weatherization assistance to transition that housing stock to one that relies more on electricity for heating. And then as we green the electricity grid, right, we can have the desired climate impact. So there's this short term, what do we actually do about people not freezing to death this winter, right? The same is true to a lesser extent in the car framework. It is the case that people don't worry as much about short-term fluctuations in gas prices, but I mean, I think I tell the story all the time now. Even my Republican neighbors are buying Teslas, and they're not doing it because they suddenly realize that climate change is very important to them. They're doing it because they think that the prices they're seeing for gasoline right now are going to be sustained, right? And they're tired of paying for that, and it's cheaper to buy a Tesla, and they can afford to buy a Tesla. So how we then again, in the short term, for lower income people, try to ameliorate some of those price impacts, I think is an important question. In the long run, I do think it will facilitate transitions to where we need to go.
Thanks. I wanted to get in a question about hydrogen from the audience. And if you think hydrogen vehicles are a better answer to getting around maybe some of the hard to decarbonize areas of transportation. And I guess if there's, what the cost and infrastructure hurdles are there.
For the heavy duty truck fleet, you're seeing big investments in Japan, Korea, China, and Germany, and the US to a certain extent, with an eye toward it being a more plausible way to convert the heavy duty fleet than to go with lithium ion batteries.
Yeah. I can take no credit for the statement because it's entirely what I learned from my colleague and friend Tim Johnson, who's a CMU alum, by the way. But when he teaches his energy technology class, he says, look, for the light vehicle fleet, the cars we're driving around all the time, if you want green hydrogen, you have to have renewable electricity to generate that green hydrogen, and you lose about, you get about 70% efficiency in that, and then you get about 70% efficiency out of the hydrogen car itself. So relative to just plugging in the car and getting the green electrons directly from the grid, it doesn't seem like a good deal. But on the heavy duty fleets, and maybe eventually for airlines too, and jet fuel, that's where we might see hydrogen be more economically viable and technically feasible.
Okay, and I wanted to get in one last question about basically what our power generation mix should be, and considering that renewables are intermittent and aren't always there when it's not sunny or windy out. Basically what should our generation mix look like?
Well, we need a substantial natural gas component for the foreseeable future, and a lot hinges on how fast do a grid scale storage technology, how fast does that price come down? If it comes down very fast, then the longevity of the natural gas sector will be shorter. If it takes longer to come down, it will be longer.
And I'll add, just on the theme of carbon taxes, that fortunately, if we had a carbon tax in place, we wouldn't have to be the ones to decide what mix of generation would exist. It would be investors making bets on what they think would be the best technology to lower carbon emissions, along with making profits. So while I do agree with John, I think electricity storage is going to be a key component, perhaps carbon capture, as Lori mentioned. Fortunately, hopefully, we'll have a carbon tax and I won't have to be the one to make that decision. Rather, it'll be investors with money on the line that'll make that decision.
Great point. Agreed.
Yeah, if we're going to rely a lot on renewables, we have to have something dispatchable that can make up the difference. And, like John said, I mean, for decades, I've been saying to students, because I teach in an environment program, if you're all keen on renewables, you better also like natural gas. I do think storage is the game changer on that. And it's possible that nuclear could play a role in that. But AJ hit the nail right on the head. I mean, the three of us shouldn't be deciding that.
That's perfect. I was hoping that you guys might want to just leave us with, kind of a brief closing thought, if there's, a takeaway from each of you that you'd like to throw out there for energy policy.
Well, let me start with both a positive remark, which is about how exciting the time is and how much tremendous career opportunities there are in different areas. And then on the skeptical side, of course, politicians are going to want to give out money and give out credits. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. We got to get the prices right.
Yeah, agreed. If I could say one thing, it would be got to get the prices on pollution right. We can't. We should let the market dictate which investment opportunities are the right ones, given the correct pricing of carbon in the atmosphere. I would say on the positive side, the transmission, the focus on transmission. John Oliver devoting a whole segment to it. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocating significant money and text to it is important. I think the transmission infrastructure is going to be key in order to get that energy from renewables to people. And then I also mentioned demand response up front. I think that's going to be a harder hurdle to get, just because, as Lori mentioned, people don't tend to respond to electricity prices unless really prodded to do so. So I think transmission, the positive side, that seems to be people are focusing on it as they should. Perhaps on the negative side, can we get more time of use pricing at the first step, a real-time pricing as the standard that we go to?
Yeah,
Well,
I guess I'll leave with a little bit back to where I started. I mean, all three of us agree on what's missing in the current bills that are either just passed or under active discussion. We all want to see a price on carbon. It simplifies things in many, many ways. At the same time, there is a lot in here to be excited about that's actually needed. In particular, investments in the grid infrastructure are long, long overdue and are critical to any successful attempt to decarbonize our electricity system. Investments in EV charging infrastructure and that kind of support services for electrification, I think they're getting right. So there's a lot in here to like. And I know there's been a lot of focus on the cost of these bills, certainly in the news that I read, but I think it's also important to remind people as we end here, and AJ alluded to this earlier, the cost of not doing this is also incredibly expensive, right? And we are seeing that in real time. And it causes harm for real people when their lights go out because there's an ice storm or there's wildfires or there's hurricanes. And we have to make some of these investments just for resiliency alone. So I'll leave with that.
Thank you so much. I really wish that we could keep going, but we are coming to the end of our hour. So thank you to Lori, AJ, and John for this awesome conversation, and to all of you for joining us today and for contributing some great questions. I feel smarter, and I hope that you do too. We talked about a lot of recommendations and solutions. So to sum that up, we've got this slide to outline much of our discussion. And we also want to take a moment to invite all of you to a few upcoming virtual events, which you will see listed on our final slide. Some links have been put in the chat box for more information on each of those. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Jennifer for moderating, and for the organizers, Katie and Shreyansh in particular, for organizing this event as well. Thanks so much.
And I'll add my
take care.
I'll add my thanks as well. It's been a lot of fun.